2015 marked the 50th anniversary of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the 10th anniversary of its British counterpart, the Arts and Humanities Research Council. This program is one of a series of international dialogues produced in partnership with Humanities Texas and the Harry Ransom Center.
I'm Evan Smith of the Texas Tribune. It's been 50 years since Congress enacted the 1965 Immigration Act. Since then, both the United States and the United Kingdom have experienced profound demographic changes through globalization, revolutions in technology, and new waves of immigrants and refugees. As a result, our two societies have become significantly more diverse, ethnically, culturally, and racially. At the same time, we've become more closely bound to the world's other communities. How does our enhanced diversity affect the cohesiveness of our societies? How does it influence the course of our representative democracies? Finally, how do the humanities foster and facilitate understanding, cohesion, and advancement of the common good in the context of our greater diversity? Joining me on stage are two participants from the UK. Journalist and author Alex Hannaford, who's currently a fellow at Columbia University, and Alison Phipps, a professor of languages and intercultural studies at the University of Glasgow. The U.S. participants are former Undersecretary of Defense Edwin Dorn, who serves on the faculty of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and veteran journalist Roberto Suro, who is currently a professor at the University of Southern California. Panelists, welcome. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
So I'm inclined, as we sit here just a few days after the tragedy in Paris, to begin by asking you whether diversity is an affliction or a liability. There are many people in the last 72 to 96 hours who are saying that it is diversity, it is the willingness to accept different people into our midst that resulted in this horrific day, and that we have to move away from accepting the other rather than toward it if we intend for our world to be secure. Professor, what do you think about that?
That's a great question. And what do I think about that? I don't think it's either or. I think the question goes to the heart of what it actually means to be a human being and to be capable of responding with compassion or with fear. And I think that goes to the heart of the questions that are within the humanities and what the humanities as a space exists to enable us to do. So when we say that the response is to drop the drawbridge and to create Fortress Europe, then we're acting out of the limbic stem at the back of our brains that says, be afraid, be very afraid. Do not ever trust anyone other than yourself. Arm yourself to the teeth and don't let anyone in. And it's a natural fear response. Every human being has it as a response to things they don't understand. Right. But equally, there's the other space that we have, that we cultivate through the humanities, through debate, through dialogue, through hospitality, through the careful, gentle practice of other modes of being that are not working out of a place of fear. And when we do that, then absolutely remarkable creative things can happen that look like hospitality, creativity, and that may be in a positive mode, what we call diversity.
Do you think that, Professor, that the instinct to rebuff diversity was there before an incident like this? Or do you think that it is an incident like this that creates that instinct?
I believe, and I speak here as somebody with a training in anthropology, I believe it is common to all human beings to respond to things we do not understand with a reaction that says, I'm scared, I don't understand it, I want to go into a comfort zone of the things I do understand. Right. I think it's something we see in situations of trauma, particularly, whether that be secondary trauma or trauma that you've immediately responded to and discovered for yourself. Right. So I don't think this is anything that's particular or peculiar or singular to this moment and these attacks in Paris. I think it's always been there. You read historical accounts, you will see people responding with fear, responding with hatred of the other, creating narratives that exclude and that say, as long as we create something that's as pure as possible, we'll be safe. And of course, what we've learned is that these narratives, these ways of behaving and these ways of arming ourselves, these ways of presenting that, neither make us safe, nor do they make us happy.
Let me ask the former Undersecretary of Defense whether security and diversity are compatible ends or compatible goals for our society. Is it possible to have them both concurrently?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. military is a very good example of that, where they take a very mixed demographic and manage to turn those men and women from all over the country, from all races and ethnic groups, into a cohesive fighting force. But back to your earlier question, I was reminded that one of the first prominent Americans to complain about the influx of immigrants was Benjamin Franklin. Back around the time the nation was being founded, Franklin wrote a long article complaining that the Germans who were moving into Pennsylvania would destroy the culture because they were absolutely incapable of assimilating. And we have gone through that with each wave of immigration. The Irish were regarded in the New York Times in the middle of the 19th century as a criminal race, incapable of being absorbed into civilized society, and so it goes.
Yep. We've been here before.
We've been here before.
Professor Suro, Undersecretary Dorn referred to assimilation as part of this conversation. One of the things we've heard in the last several days since the incident in Paris is that unlike this country where people come over here and assimilate largely into our population, that many of the folks who have come to France of late have been living in the suburbs around Paris, have not assimilated. And that part of the problem with Europe, or with France specifically, is a lack of assimilation, and that has in fact made diversity and diverse peoples more of a problem than we see actually over here. Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
I mean, it's a legitimate question. I'm not sure if it's a legitimate concern, and I think there are a number of aspects to it. I mean, when you look at what's happened in France with the new populations, particularly from North Africa and the other migrations recently, assimilation is also involves a certain amount of acceptance.
Right.
France,
it's a two-way street.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's, yeah. I mean, in assimilation, part of the problem with the word is it assumes that the stranger is making all of the
right. The
distance.
burden is on the person who arrives.
Yeah, and so France has treated many of its newcomers in quite an exclusionary manner.
Right.
So there have been very few opportunities to assimilate economically and culturally there. But I think it's before we go too far in this direction, I think I want to offer a corrective. I mean, it's true that fear of the stranger and rejection of the stranger is something that seems innate. And you see it in every society that is involved in the process of migration. Right. I mean, it's a commonplace. Happens everywhere at every time there's this kind of rejection. But the other side of it is that it's equally natural for human beings to form societies. Right. That involves dealing with otherness. The dealing with otherness starts the minute you're born, because the last person who you were not other from was your mother. After that, everybody else is another. Right. What we are extremely good at as a species is building societies that incorporate others. Right. And to start with the assumption that rejection is the natural response, I think gets us off. I worry about going down that direction without balancing it. Right. With the good news. You started by invoking the Immigration Act of 1965. Enormous unintended consequences. When that bill was signed, Lyndon Johnson said, nothing we do here today is going to change anything about the United States. Mm-hmm. Right? The notion was that the demography of the United States would be completely unchanged. No president ever said, let's take a country that's 80% white and let's make it 55% white and see how that goes. Right? I mean, nobody, and won an election based on that. So there are enormous unintended consequences. But it has been a remarkable success. Right. I mean, we have 50 years of welcoming diverse peoples, of completely transforming our population while dealing with a whole series of other challenges. A fundamental rethinking of how we operate as a society, the boundaries in our society, how we deal with race, how we deal with gender, all these things happening at the same time. And it has been, on balance, an enormous success. And I think it's very dangerous to lose sight of that, given very dramatic events, very dangerous events, very significant events. But you've got to, there's a bigger picture here that we have to our platform is one of success.
Right.
Certainly in this society, certainly in the UK, on balance, the diversification of the population in the United Kingdom has, on balance, been an enormous success.
Yeah. Well, let me take Professor Suro at his word, Mr. Hannaford, and say we're a nation of immigrants, that one of the most wonderful and successful features of the country in which we live is that we are a nation of immigrants. And at the same time, we still have resentments, anxiety, fear. We have a presidential campaign that is pivoting entirely off of fear of the other, resentment of the other, anxiety about the other. It is the number one issue in every election cycle, going back 1, 2, 3 cycles, and it is the number one issue in the election cycle up until at least this incident in Paris, where now the conversation may pivot to a different kind of fear of the other. But the fact is, immigration as an issue in this country is both undeniably, as Professor Suro says, an element of our success as a nation, but it continues to generate 50 years after the Immigration Act, resentment, fear, anxiety, and the like.
I think it should be, the knee-jerk reaction should be a cause of national embarrassment, actually. This reaction to what's happened in Paris by politicians suddenly saying that we shouldn't take in any more Syrian refugees is embarrassing.
And in fact, we've now seen, again, 72, 96 hours after the events in Paris, 20 different governors of states around this country say we are not going to take any refugees because we're not satisfied that we are sufficiently assuring that they are who they say they are, and that we're going to be able to ensure the security of our own people in these states.
And I don't know whether that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the politics of Syria at the moment and what's going on there, or whether they're just playing politics, or possibly whether they really think this is going to stop terrorists striking at the heart of America.
Is there an all of the above option?
Maybe. I'll tell you, I was in...
and grandstanding going together?
Oh,
shocked. Exactly.
I was in...
A dangerous but familiar cocktail, right? That's it.
I was in Calais a year ago doing a story on the refugee crisis in Europe. And among the people that I spoke to and interviewed, there was one guy who's a Syrian guy called Ahmed, who was sleeping in a doorway of a church in Calais. And I spent 2 days with him and his friends, and I actually focused my story on another kid, but Ahmed and I sort of kept in touch, because everybody has cell phones and everyone has Facebook, right? So I've kept in touch with him for the last year, sort of finding out what's happening to him. Ahmed was actually in Paris the morning of the attacks, and I was doubly worried about what was happening to him, because number one, he's in a city that's just been attacked by terrorists. Number two, he's sort of presumably going to be at the forefront of any potential repercussions.
Right.
300, I think, tents were set alight in the migrant camp in Calais 2 hours after this happened. Yeah. This is a guy who has had his house destroyed by regime forces in Syria, who escaped because he needed somewhere where he wouldn't be in fear of his life, and wanted to get to the UK. Didn't end up going to the UK. Ended up claiming asylum successfully in France, and now he's being accused of terrorism essentially as well. Right. And he's running away from that. He's running away from war. He was with the Free Syrian Army, so we're funding him. We were funding him. So I think it's disgusting. When I watch what's happening and the sort of political knee-jerk response to this, it's embarrassing. And I think it's not difficult to educate yourselves about what's happening. It's a complicated situation in Syria. It's not a case of good versus evil, but it just seems that a lot of politicians here need to couch it in those terms.
Right. And yet, Mr. Secretary, the President said today, as we sit here, that he was going to proceed with his plan to accept 10,000 Syrian refugees, provided that the security, background checks and all that, those issues all lined up. He was not going to react as the governors of these states that Mr. Hannaford referred to.
Thank God he's not reacting the way these guys are reacting, but he doesn't have a choice. It is very difficult for any president of the United States to pull together a coalition
right.
of European countries and Arab countries to deal with the crisis in Syria.
Right.
And then say, but by the way, those refugees are going to be your problem. You
Right.
just can't do that.
Right.
Even a much less enlightened president than Barack Obama would find himself in that situation. I'm frankly delighted that the president is sticking to his position. I am, like Alex, embarrassed by some of our governors.
Right. And of course, who better to take this position than the first sort of truly global president we've had? Somebody whose background and whose orientation and disposition is more outward looking than inward looking.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
But that also explains why these governors are taking that position. We've talked about the success of immigration.
Yes.
But we need to talk about one big difference between the pre-1965 Immigration Reform Act and the current situation. The nation is changing from black and white to color.
Yes.
Our narrative, our historic narrative, has been a story of an overwhelmingly white population and a relatively small black minority, with a few Hispanics, a few Indians on the margins of the picture.
Yes.
The immigration stream since the 1960s has been a very different matter. Remember that for close to a century, Asians were not allowed to immigrate into the country, and for that matter, since 1790, between 1790 and the early 1950s, non-whites were not allowed to become naturalized citizens of the United States. Large numbers of us are having trouble adjusting to a new narrative. We don't know how to think in color because we grew up thinking in black and white. And there's a psychological element here. We think in binary terms: mom, dad, male, female, right, wrong, black, white. And so, as Alex said, it is very hard for us to get our minds around a more complicated situation.
Right.
How did we adjust to immigration in the past? Well, we had large streams of immigrants from Europe, and our trick was to resist them during the first generation and then to make them white as quickly as possible. In fact, there's a wonderful, cleverly written book called How the Irish Became White. And one could write that about large numbers of other people as well. Now we're dealing with a very different situation, and there is a kind of a race to see whether or not different groups of Asians, the Chinese, the Japanese, Pakistanis, Indians, can be turned white, or whether they will represent a very different form of, if you will, political and cultural assimilation. Meanwhile, there is a great deal of nervousness about this immigration flow, and that's Donald Trump's constituency.
Well, in fact, that is the conversation that we seem to be having politically. Let's remind ourselves, let's be reminded in our conversation of the positive aspects of diversity, the ways in which, to begin, diversity enlivens our democratic principles and practices and informs the values that we talk about every election cycle and between election cycles. Professor Phipps, make the positive case for the ways in which diversity enlivens our democracies.
Why would we want to starve ourselves of diversity? You know, I work in contexts which have received a great deal of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, and you see people coming together and rubbing up against each other in ways that means they've really got to solve problems together that bring an extraordinary creative energy. And then you see other contexts where there's no migration allowed. You know, there might be states under siege where you can't get in and you can't get out, or they might be sending contexts. Poland would be one very good example, which is also a country which has said it will not take refugees following this.
Right.
There are villages in Bulgaria, for example, which have said even though they have a population that's over 60, They don't want to take any young people. They would rather die out. And I think that's really one of the things we're looking at here. We're almost looking at, within these narratives of fear and the way that people will link themselves deeply into that and allow that to be the context that holds them, you're actually looking at Thanos. You're looking at a politics of death and of dying out ultimately, when people are actually getting to that point. When you look at the opposite and you see, the extraordinary context and story and history that is the United States, with everything that it's managed to achieve through its politics of diversity and of immigration, but also places like London, which is a city like no other, almost a city-state in and of itself, and what it's managed to achieve as a result of those multicultural ways of living and working and moving together, then I think you see something quite extraordinary happening. But I also think you see it most of all, and it's always where I would start, in the quick of human relationship, in the place where you meet people who you don't quite understand, and yet somehow you find a common place of understanding. And for me, that's a deep and significant place of human encounter. It cannot happen when we push each other into boxes that say black, white, male, female, when we actually hold down and hammer ourselves down into mono positions, mono of whatever it might be, monocultural, monolingual, where we say there's only one narrative, there can only be one language. When we do that, we divest ourselves of all possibility of intercultural and international relationships.
Well, and in fact, Professor, it's reinforcing what Professor Phipps and honestly what Undersecretary Dorn talked about, the binary choice. We live in a world today where people have headphones in their ears as they walk down the street to keep the outside world from penetrating their brains. You curate your satellite radio channels to reinforce your bias. You curate your Twitter feeds for the same. You can go a day or a week or a lifetime if you choose to without encountering a point of view, a perspective, or a cultural view other than your own. We have exiled ourselves into these. And so I'm taken by what Professor Phipps is saying, because the opportunity exists, if we choose to take it, to not interact with people who might enrich us with the differences that they have with us, right? And our world has become more polarized today as a result of that.
I'm not sure, as an empirical question, I'm not sure that it's entirely an option. You
don't think people these days have more of a choice and more of a motivation to opt out of interacting people of unlike minds?
You can certainly choose to where you get information and cultural content and such as that. If you want to attend a school or a university, or if you want to work for a large corporation in the United States, diversity is not an option. I mean, it's not like you've got a choice about it. If you want to live in a major American city, it's not an option. It's there. It's the reality. I mean, that's over. I mean, the idea of an America that's not diverse was something you might have discussed 30 years ago, but it's over now.
But you would acknowledge that there is a subset of the population that nonetheless resists.
Of course, they resist it, but
the onset of multiculturalism.
They resist that, and there's also, there's fundamental resistance to change and to otherness. But that also comes, and people are resisting a lot of things. They're resisting seeing their jobs disappear. They're resisting seeing their communities disrupted. They're resisting changes in the way religion is practiced in their communities. They're resisting changes in institutions. There's a lot of what we're talking about here, and I don't mean to keep parsing the basic theme here, but a lot of this anger is displacement. It's classic. I had, the reason why I was mean to my partner at home was because I had a lousy day at work. Right? I mean, that's as fundamental as fear of the other. And immigrants are very easy targets because they stand out.
Because they can easily be scapegoated.
Right. But beyond that, I mean, the notion, I mean, it is going to get increasingly difficult. It's still possible. It's still possible in parts of this state. And there are parts of this country where you can do this still.
Right.
You can't do it in Austin. and be successful.
Right.
But there are fewer and fewer places where you can say, I will only deal with people who are like me,
Right.
and be able to put together a successful lifestyle.
Right.
I mean, earn money, be educated, and succeed politically. I mean, there are fewer and fewer places like that. And if you look at the demography of this country, you know, the native-born population under the age of 5 in this country is 55% white. That other 45%, you're not going to be able to, where are you going to put them, in Alaska?
Right.
I mean, people are going to have to deal with it.
But I come back to Mr. Hannaford, this idea that we're witnessing the playing out of a presidential campaign where exactly what Professor Suro says is unavoidable is the
But what is it really about?
narrative.
But what is the presidential campaign really about? I mean, Donald Trump,
And not just Donald Trump.
No, but it's easy to talk about immigrants, people. It's happened lots, but is that really what the anger, what the anxiety about the insecurity is about?
Well, it is in large part, and it is in large part a matter of fantasy. We have a fantasy about what the country ought to be like. And that fantasy has been upset by demographic change. And along comes someone who says, we're going to make America great again. What he really means is that we want an America in which the same people who were responsible 50 years ago are responsible today. He doesn't really mean we're going to make America great again. He really means we want to make America white again. But people enjoy that fantasy. They know there's no chance that Donald Trump is going to load 11 million people aboard railway cars and
ship them off.
Buses and ship them off, but they love the fantasy.
So it's a guilty pleasure, it's a cost-free fantasy, but nobody actually believes it's going to happen.
Well, it is not cost-free for this republic, and it is not cost-free for the party he wants to represent.
But isn't it possible that he is also saying that what people are responding to when he says he's going to make America great again is that you'll actually see a real increase in your income sometime in your lifetime? You know, or that the 2 million jobs that have disappeared since 2006 are coming back.
You think it's a practical, pragmatic
I'm just suggesting
appeal to
that
better
maybe,
times?
I think I'm suggesting that maybe it's more complicated, that nativism in this country, anywhere, every time you look at it, there are always underlying causes. There always is an element of displacement. And it is analytically, it has always been a mistake to say it's just about immigrants. In this case, illegal immigration in this country has come, we are 10 years past the peak.
Right. Well, in fact, there have been statistics out of Washington over the last couple of years that there have been many more deportations under this president than the previous presidents, that net migrations are at or near zero or have been for some time. So, Mr. Hannaford, I'm responding to this great conversation about the good old days. And, I'm tempted to say that we have a bit of a restoration hardware problem in this country, that we're nostalgic for a time that never was, That we tend to romanticize the good old days beyond reality. It's hard not to accept what the Undersecretary says, though, about making America great again, or some version of that, appealing to people who want to turn the clock back on much of the diversity that we've seen in this country since the passage of the Immigration Act.
This whole fear of the other, it reminded me of worked on a story a couple of years ago about open carry. We were talking about guns just before this started, but there was a researcher, I wish I was trying to remember what university she was associated with, but she did a survey of concealed carry owners, so they have their concealed carry permits, and she asked them when they sort of had this a fantasy, if you like, of why they would need their gun when they went out. What situation did they see unfolding that would make them want to carry their gun concealed, downtown? And I can't remember what the percentage, a huge percentage of them had this fear of the other, and the other meant someone of a different colour to them.
Somebody who didn't look like
Someone who didn't look like them. And because concealed carry permit holders are overwhelmingly white and middle class, and middle-aged probably. I can't remember. You know, it's a race thing. You know, it's racism.
Right. You believe it's racism?
Oh, that's part of it.
You believe it's racism?
I think racism is complicated, and I think if you were to ask why a white, middle-aged, middle-class male in the United States is anxious, there are lots of reasons. There are lots of good reasons. Now, if you poke them and you say, make it about guns or make it about immigrants, that's politics, that's communication. You can frame the anxiety. You can make people express their anger however you want if you're good at it. And even if you're not particularly good at it, as Donald Trump is. But that doesn't mean that you've actually found the source of the anxiety or that you're going to cure it.
He may not be particularly good at it, but as we sit here in November, the summer fling has extended into an autumn fling.
You know, Bruce Ding.
And if what you do in that context is allow political leaders to make statements which are essentially incitements to racial hatred, as we have recently in the UK with our Prime Minister, who has called immigrants swarms, who has used dehumanising language about anybody coming to the country, who has deliberately messed around with the language that's shifting anyway in the public domain around what it means legally to be seeking asylum, to be somebody who is a refugee, to be under humanitarian protection. These are complicated phrases in law, but who's deliberately messed around with that, and who's actually spoken about people who wish to come to the UK as breaking into the country. When you do that, you're inciting. You can expect violence. When what you do structurally is pass laws that say, if you come to our country, you can have £34 a week to live on. We will put you into a process that is very unfair indeed. You will be held in all kinds of detention centres for a long time. You will then be deported, and then we'll be surprised. We'll be surprised when the stories you tell about the United Kingdom are stories which are the precise stories that produce the kinds of fear that we're seeing at the moment. That situation is one we're living with at the moment. We are seeing political leadership in the United Kingdom and in some parts of Europe and in some parts of your political presidential campaign in the US at the moment that are doing precisely that, and it's extremely dangerous ground. But there is an alternative. There's always an alternative. Now, I live in a small country called Scotland. It has about 5.5 million people living there. We've just gone through an extraordinary process, a revolutionary process in the last 2 years of asking ourselves the question, what kind of country do we want to live in? What does inclusive nationalism look like? What does it mean to be a citizen? Who's in and who's out? Now, we've taken that as a serious set of issues and a political, educational conversation that means that every single public meeting, certainly that I've attended, was stowed out, as we say. It was packed to the gunnels with people wanting to ask the question and be part of a discussion about what it might mean to live in a better society, a good society, the common weal, we would call it. You call it the common good within the humanities. We have at the moment a Minister for External Relations in Scotland. Now, this is interpolated by politics in Westminster, but in Scotland, who then says, 2 days after the posting of the picture of the Kurdish refugee Aylan Kurdi's body on the beach, I want Scotland to be known as a compassionate country. We have a First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, who stood in Glasgow Central Mosque at the weekend as part of the common cause of a Muslim community and other communities within Scotland, remembering the dead in the Lebanon, in Turkey, in Paris, but also the week when, under humanitarian protection, the very first of the Syrian humanitarian protection refugees will arrive in Scotland. And what she said was, we are their refuge. We cannot stop this compassion that we wish to show being prevented by a tiny minority of people who are intent on violence. Those people have always existed throughout history. People with an intent to destroy. It's extremely easy to destroy a human life in an instant. It takes years to build one up and make it beautiful.
Mr. Undersecretary.
Let me go back to Roberto Suro's comment about the sources of our political dyspepsia. The bad mood that seems to be roiling the country, particularly on the political right. There's the economic problem. And part of this is nicely captured in a great song by Bruce Springsteen called Glory Days. And he imagines these guys sitting in a bar, drinking beer, talking about that last championship football game. And now, as the lyrics say, things have changed a lot. They have to remember the glory days. They haven't had a good day since. Well, what's been going on? It's partly economic. It's part. I could make a local reference.
Don't say it too soon. Too soon.
We have 2 games to go. There's still hope.
Yeah.
There's the economic change.
Right.
There's which does leave a lot of people very uncomfortable. Levels of labor force participation are going down. But you can imagine these guys sitting in a bar also, well, complaining about the immigrants.
Sure.
But also complaining about the women. After all, that plain girl who used to sit in the front of the class, who answered all the questions and whom none of the popular guys would ask out, well, she's now the boss. She's now the boss down at the plant where these guys work. This is all emasculating. Yeah. And for some group of people, a generation or 2 generations of men of a certain background, this this produces anger and anxiety.
Right.
That's where we are.
Right. But of course, Professor, this is not a new phenomenon. It's not about the emerging Hispanic population in this country or refugees. I go back to the Senate race in North Carolina when Jesse Helms put on an ad against Harvey Gantt that featured a pair of black hands. And there was an appeal to this idea that you needed that job, you wanted that job, and they gave it to a black applicant. Somehow that affirmative action was this crippling and dehumanizing, what did you say, emasculating force in this country. We've had appeals that to that instinct going back
Benjamin Franklin.
Decades. This is not a new phenomenon.
Right.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. I mean, the danger is to not look behind it and to engage the debate and accept the terms of it. Because and to fail to understand where this anxiety is coming from and how it's manifesting itself. Right. I mean, you look now. I mean, you have these. We've identified a series of very large phenomena. A fundamental, the deindustrialization of America, the rewriting of our civil rights statutes, and the changes in gender roles. And today, it's reduced to blame on 15,000 potential Syrian refugees. Right. So I mean, we have taken these enormous things, and by virtue of sloppy, sort of dishonest political rhetoric, reduced it, put the blame down on something very small and on people who you can just brush aside. You can't brush the woman who's running the plant. You can't say, we're going to put you back in the kitchen. Too late for that, right? You can't.
But you can reduce her reproductive choices, which is another part of this.
That may be a different program than the one that we're actually taking. Mr. Hannaford.
I wonder whether the language that we use as well is important here, because I mean, the BBC have been guilty of this, calling all the refugees in Europe migrants, referring to them as migrants. And I think that language, if you hear people talking about migrants, they think economic migrants, and that immediately gets people's heckles up, I think, particularly on the right. They're coming and stealing our jobs. They're
takers and not makers.
They're takers and not makers.
By the parlance of our country.
And ironically, you get the same people saying they're stealing all our jobs and they're sponging off the state. They can't be doing both.
Right. How can you sponge if you're actually... Right. Let me stay with language, but in a different context. I wonder if linguistic differences are part of this conversation. We hear from time to time, again, nodding in the direction of the emerging Latino population in this country, that somehow everybody should be forced to learn and to speak English, that somehow bilingualism, dual language, is a bad thing, as opposed to something that enables populations of people who have arrived in this country to be assimilated in their own way and in their own due course. Could you talk about the degree to which linguistic differences, and for that matter, expand it, religious differences, are somehow contributing to this divide? I
think, Ben Carrington, who was a professor here at UT, was saying on a panel earlier that, diversity is sort of shorthand for racism. And I think that, this idea that, we don't, why on earth would I certainly don't want to live in a place where everyone is of the same race, religion, everyone's speaking this. I mean, I come from London. I grew up, I spent my early childhood in Nigeria, grew up in London, and I love London. And I love London because I can walk down the street and hear people talking in, you know, in different languages, any number of languages, and I can, you know, that's what I love about it. I think that, yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah. But Professor Suro, you know that there are people who will say, well, if you're going to come to this country, if you're going to, you know, take advantage of all it means is, you know, to be an American, at the least, you should be speaking our language. It's essentially a direct rebuttal to the idea that diverse peoples should bring their culture and their way of being and have it be alongside our own.
Right. I mean, the problem with that argument is that, in fact, people who come to this country do learn English.
Right.
I mean, the immigrants of our era, of our time now, actually are learning English sooner, better, than the idealized immigrants of the transatlantic era.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all sort of, I mean, the English argument is really, there's an element of really, it does expose the ridiculousness of some of this, in that English has become the dominant language of the species.
Right.
I mean, it's become the first truly global language.
Right.
And the notion that somehow English is endangered is so laughable that, I mean, it's cosmically
they're
laughable.
taking our health care, they're taking our in-state tuition, and they're taking our language.
And our language is going to disappear. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, that's really where that's where the avariciousness, is that the right word, of this, you know, appears. I mean, the fear of losing some kind of patrimony. And I think, you know, again, it's a clue that it's not about language.
Right.
I mean, that would be, people aren't so fundamentally irrational.
Yeah, and to Mr. Anniford's point, in Europe, they may not be having the same version of this conversation we're having.
No, and let me just add one other thing. Yeah. The other point that's really important to underscore is that there are large populations of people in this country who seek out the London experience that you described, Alex. Our coastal cities, and Chicago and a few other places, Austin becoming one of them, are places that are attracting people.
Melting pots.
Because, for the very reason that they are diverse. People want to live in cities where there are lots of other kinds of people. You make more money, you have more fun. You know, and that dynamic,
and there is evidence that correlates diversity with those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. We look at you know, the population.
Well, fun seems an intangible.
Well, but it's a matter of taste.
Higher incomes seem to be tangible. That's a tangible.
Of course. Well, and if you are interested in participating in the growing parts of the economy, then you need to be in these places.
And yet in this country, 10% of white people are living in poverty versus 25% Hispanic, 27.2% black. So
the English-only stuff is exactly backwards. The problem is not that too few people speak English, or that many immigrants may not learn English fast enough. The problem is that too few native-born American citizens speak any language other than English. We are at a huge disadvantage.
Do you think we're resisting globalization in this country?
I think we are. In spite of what Roberto just said, English is a nearly universal language among well-educated people. But if you visit Japan, if you visit Russia, if you visit France, people are a lot more comfortable with you if you can converse with them in their language. It's a door opener, and we have failed to open a lot of those doors because of our ignorance of other languages.
Similar or different in your part of the world, Professor?
I think it's very similar. The UK at the moment is passing an increasing number of laws to make it a requirement of the workplace, particularly in the public sector, that you've already passed a number of English language tests. So that question is now being mixed in with the legal requirements around immigration. So we're seeing some similar things. So yeah, you know, they're taking our language, they're taking our women, they're taking our jobs. What isn't being taken is part of this unthinking narrative that you can find. And yet, you know, these two contexts, the UK and the US, are the exceptions to the rule worldwide. Multilingualism is normal, very, very normal. And one of the things I do in my work is I have the privilege of training some of the police officers in Scotland who are the brave men and women who go into homes where a murder has been committed. They're the family liaison officers is what we call them. Yep. And they've been having real struggles around questions of race, but also questions of language and questions of intercultural tolerance. And they're not quite sure what they're getting wrong, but they know the more work they try and put in to doing it right, the harder it gets. And so one of the things we've been doing there is just giving people the experience of what it feels like to try and speak a language other than English. So one of the exercises I do with the police officers is say, okay, greet each other and then have a conversation about the weather in a language other than English. So they get into little groups and they start to do this. And I watch what happens to them and they watch what happens to each other, and what happens is they start to sweat, they go red, they tremble, they're embarrassed, they don't know what to do or say, they start to mime and gesture, there are awkward pauses, and then we stop and we say, and I say to them, imagine you've just had 2 police officers walk into your home, there's been a murder in your house, and you're now being expected to communicate in a language that is maybe your 4th language. In those times of trauma, we have to have a safe place to go back to, and that will be our mother tongue. Now, it strikes me that the English assimilation discourse points to a profound anxiety and trauma across the societies where those are the debates that are going on, and that it's another element, a presenting issue, a displacement issue, about much deeper insecurities about who we are now and where we are, and that fit in very much with what you were saying, Ed, around the issues to do with the place of women in society and the place of otherness, and the failure of political leadership, and the failure, I think, of the humanities to put in place a strong enough educational program that means on a regular basis we can practice what it means to live out a common life. So I do quite a lot of work in Ghana at the moment as part of the work I'm doing with the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And one of the things I've noticed in that context is there's 9 or 10 languages circulating regularly. So Twi or Ga or Afka or whatever the language might be that is being spoken. But you never quite know what you're going to be greeted in. And yet built into conversation structures is a way of people saying, in my language, this is what we mean. In my custom, this is what we do. Now, we don't do that. And recently, as part of the refugee task force work that I'm doing in Scotland at the moment, we invited Congolese refugees who'd been resettled from the Congo about 8 years ago to Scotland to speak about their experiences. And there's a sentence they brought out which really shocked us and I think is right on the button of what we're talking about here. And what they said was, you here, you in this English-speaking country, you are stingy with your language. You do not speak to us in the street. And that points to those moments of social cohesion, of the thing that the social miracle, the fact that we might speak to our neighbours. Now, when we're harking back to these situations in the 1950s, this good old days, they were days when we actually spoke to our neighbours. We didn't just get in the car and go away and put on the music.
In that respect, they are good old days. And I'm wondering, as we are coming to the end of our time here, if this problem that we've discussed, sort of all 4 corners of the problem, is fixing to take care of itself. We are now in an increasingly multicultural country, whether some people like it or not. The last presidential election was decided by the aptly named by Ron Brownstein of the National Journal, the Coalition of the Ascendant. Women, gays and lesbians, young people, African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. Here in the state of Texas, we graduated the last majority white class from Texas public schools in 2014. We'll never head back. The former demographer of the state of Texas and former Census Bureau Director Steve Murdoch says effectively, looking at the numbers to come in Texas and the rest of the country, it's over for the Anglos. That the influence of white people and particularly white men is on the wane, is never going to return to what it once was. Is it possible that for all the difficulty we're having with diversity, embracing diversity, seeing the benefits of diversity to our democracy, to our society, to our culture, that this problem is going to take care of itself, that tincture of time, as my grandmother used to say, is going to be the salve, the balm, that's going to take care of this problem, Mr. Hannaford.
This idea that that generation are dying out.
Right.
Yeah, I think so.
There's nothing that you can do about that, and that problem more than any other is going to take care of.
But I think the problem is that the people that you were just talking about, the people that voted, and that sort of decided that vote, they want it to happen now. They don't want it to happen in another generation.
They're not patient.
No. Well,
right.
and nor should they be.
Right. Mr. Undersecretary, you understand that there's an inevitability to demography in this country right now.
Demography is destiny, but there are a whole lot of folks who are fighting it.
Right.
And so there is a lot of nastiness between here and the future. And I will go back to something that I said earlier. We still do not know how to think in color.
And that's not something that's apt to happen any better anytime soon. It may happen eventually.
That's right.
Right.
That's a process of discovery and experimentation.
Right. Professor, you know, we started off by talking about how this is a meaningful anniversary for the National Endowment for the Humanities and a meaningful anniversary for its British counterpart. Are the humanities there to play a role in litigating this for us?
Yeah, I think, a very important role. I mean, the humanities are one of the ways that people learn to think in color. They start telling stories in color. They start painting pictures in color.
Right.
They find, the humanities provide a meeting place. They provide a place where creative minds can join together and create new versions of reality, new vocabularies. I think it's happening already. You've got to come to Southern California. You can't avoid the colors there.
Yeah.
But there, of course, time, it won't take care of itself. Demography is mathematical, but social change isn't.
Right.
Social change is messy. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back,
And while
1 step
demographic
sideways.
change can be precipitous, social change can be glacial.
Yeah, and this has been already taking place for a long time.
Right.
It's been a long time coming, and it'll take a long time further. And it's,
Right.
it's a process of destruction and invention happening at the same time. I don't think it's hard to imagine a more exciting time to be in this country. Things are changing, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, and there will be casualties.
At the same time, change can happen extremely quickly. So there's a wonderful title of a book about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is "Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More." And you can wake up and you find that the revolution's happened, and it's one of the experiences we've actually just had within the Scottish context. That political education, that sense of questioning, means that nothing's the same as it was. We haven't glacially, slowly moved to a new situation any more than we are doing.
Yeah, no, we've had that here. We had it in 2008. The day after that election, people realized this is a different country than we ever thought it was.
And more recently, the passage of, or the acceptance of same-sex marriage,
right? Yeah.
By the Supreme Court and as the law of this country, it seemed as if that change happened.
Right.
Whoosh,
well, and we also had it with the recession,
right?
Which something that I don't think we have yet to really understand how that plays into all of this. To be trying to do this all at a time when the economy is insecure and people sense it, people feel it in their bones, that this country is not back yet. That that there's things that are wobbly about it. It makes it much more difficult. We're talking about a change that plays out across all levels of society, and there's a lot of interaction.
Yeah.
It's going back to where we started, the notion of assimilation, where somebody starts here and moves in a straight line and adopts a national type, has never been the case. It is a process of change where the newcomers and the existing population are interacting and changing in a big, messy a situation of friction that's inevitable and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And you have to. I recall having a conversation with a German magistrate in the early 1990s when they were burning hostels in Bavaria, immigrant hostels. And she said to me, you have to accept the fear and look beyond it. To be able to manage situations like this, you just have to say, yes, there's fear.
Yeah.
But what's past that?
Right.
And there's going to be fear every day in this country until... it will never go away. It's part of social change.
Yeah, but there is always something past it.
Yeah.
Okay, a perfect place to end. They're telling me that we're out of time. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to have this great conversation. Alex Hannaford, Alison Phipps, Ed Dorn, Roberto Suro. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
So what do you think it's going to take for the dialogue to change that we're seeing nationally within the US and the UK, that our politicians are taking up this really divisive dialogue? Do you think it needs to come from the people? What do you think that change will take?
I think we need political leadership. I think it's really important, and I think it's an absolutely key element within this, that we have politicians who are prepared to act morally within these questions and to act in the interest, not so much of the myth of scarcity, because it is a myth. You know, we're talking about the richest countries in the world saying what, 10,000, 20,000, when there are 60 million displaced people worldwide. You know, 1 in 4 in Lebanon. You know, massive populations, over 2 million turning up in Turkey, in Jordan. I mean, what are we talking about here? It's pathetic. So we need political leadership, and political leadership that's careful, that's judicious, that takes its time and that makes the right decisions, that doesn't do emergency thinking, but actually really finds a way of addressing the issue. But we as individuals also have a role in this. We are changed by relationships. That's what makes things different. And I've spoken in other places about the fact that as a result of seeing what's been happening over the last 10 years within the UK, we've decided to make our home a house of hospitality, a house of sanctuary, a place in which people who are destitute and asylum seekers or refugees can come and live until such time as their case has been heard. They're no longer destitute and they have a place to live. That is the single best decision I have ever made in my life. It's the greatest education I've ever had. And equally, I have seen the best in people as a result of doing it, as well as some of the worst, it has to be said. There are racists out there, and you get a really thick skin very quickly as soon as you actually act in solidarity and as an accomplice with people of colour.